The day my husband died, his sister told me to leave the house. Not gently, not quietly, not even with fake sympathy. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom I'd shared with my husband for 22 years, arms crossed, eyes already calculating, and said, "You don't need to be here anymore. We'll handle things from here." Handle things. I was still wearing the clothes I'd slept in at the hospital. My hair smelled like antiseptic and grief. My chest felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything solid and left me standing on fumes alone. I remember blinking at her, certain I'd misheard. "This is my home," I said. She didn't flinch. "Well," she replied, glancing past me at the furniture, the photos, the life we'd built, "we'll see about that." That was how it started. Not with paperwork, not with lawyers, not with a formal dispute, with entitlement. By the end of the week, my husband was buried and his siblings had organized a family meeting without me. When I found out, it wasn't from them. It was from a cousin who whispered it like a warning. "They're saying you're not legally entitled to anything," she said. "They're saying he promised the estate would stay in the bloodline." Bloodline, as if love had never mattered, as if marriage was temporary, as if I'd been a guest in my own life. I sat at our kitchen table after that call, staring at the mug he'd used every morning. My hands shook so badly the coffee rippled over the edge. Grief pressed down on me from every angle, but beneath it, something darker began to form. Recognition. My husband had warned me about this. Not explicitly, not dramatically, just small comments over the years. "If anything ever happens to me," he'd say, "don't let anyone rush you," or "people show their true selves when money's involved." I hadn't wanted to imagine a world without him long enough to ask why. Now I knew. 2 days later, his brother showed up unannounced with a folder under his arm. He didn't sit down, didn't ask how I was holding up, just placed the folder on the table like he was doing me a favor. "We're going to need access to the accounts and the deed. This will be easier if you cooperate." Cooperate. With what? I asked quietly. "With what your husband would have wanted," he said smoothly. That sentence lit something inside me. "My husband," I replied, meeting his eyes for the first time, "wanted me taken care of." His jaw tightened. "That's not how this works," he said. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I stood up, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled out a small locked box my husband had insisted we keep there just in case. Inside were documents I hadn't opened yet because until that moment, I hadn't been ready. I placed the box on the table between us. "I think," I said evenly, "we should all be very careful about what we assume." For the first time since he walked in, uncertainty crossed his face. What they didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that my husband had planned for this exact moment, not out of fear, out of love. And what he left behind wasn't just money. It was proof. And as his siblings began circling, confident they could erase me quietly, I realized something that steadied me more than any comfort ever could. They thought I was alone. They were wrong. The box sat between us like a dare. My brother-in-law didn't reach for it. He stared at it the way people stare at things that might explode if handled wrong. His confidence, the same confidence he'd walked in with, had begun to thin around the edges. "What's that supposed to be?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. I was still getting used to the sound of my own steadiness. Grief had taken so much from me already, but in its place, something solid was forming, something unmovable. "It's something my husband wanted me to have," I said, "and only me." He scoffed, but the sound lacked conviction. "If there was a will, we'd know about it." That almost made me smile. "You assume a lot," I replied. "That seems to be a pattern." He left soon after, muttering something about lawyers and timelines, but not before warning me again that I should be reasonable, as if reason meant surrender, as if my silence would make their lies legitimate. The moment the door closed, my knees gave out. I sank into the chair and pressed my palms flat against the table, breathing through a wave of emotion that finally crashed through me. The house felt too big without my husband's presence, every room echoing with what used to be. I wanted to call him, to ask him what to do, to tell him they were already trying to take everything. Instead, I opened the box. Inside were neatly organized documents, just as he'd always done things. Copies of our marriage certificate, updated account information, a sealed envelope labeled in his handwriting, "For you, only if you need it." My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter inside wasn't long, but every word felt deliberate. "If you're reading this, then I was right about them rushing you. I'm sorry you have to deal with this on top of losing me. Please remember this. You are my family. I made sure the law agrees with me." Tears blurred the page. Beneath the letter were USB drives labeled by date and a folder marked legal, final. I didn't open everything at once. I couldn't. It felt too intimate, like overhearing his voice in a moment meant only for us. Instead, I locked the box again and placed it back in the closet, my resolve firming with every step. They wanted chaos? I would give them order. The next morning, I called an attorney recommended by a friend. I didn't explain everything, just enough to be taken seriously. By the end of the call, she told me something that felt like oxygen. "Do not give them anything," she said. "Not documents, not access, not explanations. Let them talk. We'll let the evidence speak." Evidence. That word wrapped around me like armor. By the end of the week, my husband's siblings had escalated. Emails, voicemails, thinly veiled threats disguised as concern. They talked about court dates and family reputations and how ugly things could get. What they didn't talk about was the truth. And that was fine by me, because every message they sent, every demand they made, only strengthened the case my husband had quietly prepared. He knew them too well, known that grief would make me vulnerable, and that they would mistake vulnerability for weakness. They were wrong. What they saw as a widow they could overwhelm was a woman being held upright by her husband's final act of protection. And when this went to court, they wouldn't just be facing me, they'd be facing him, still speaking, still choosing me. And the moment they realized that, everything would change. Grief makes people impatient. They want closure, resolution, an ending they can package neatly and walk away from. But my husband's siblings weren't looking for closure. They were looking for control. And when they realized I wasn't handing it to them quietly, their patience evaporated. The first letter from their attorney arrived on a Monday morning. It was thick, intimidating on purpose, filled with language meant to scare me into compliance, claims about verbal promises, family intent, and suggestions that my husband had been pressured into decisions late in life. Pressured? I laughed once, a short, sharp sound that surprised even me. My husband was many things, but easily pressured wasn't one of them. I forwarded the letter to my attorney without responding. She called me within the hour. "They're bluffing," she said, "but they're also panicking." That word stuck with me. Panicking. Because panic makes people sloppy. And sure enough, the next move they made was reckless. His youngest brother showed up at the house while I was out, claiming he needed to retrieve personal items. If I hadn't installed cameras years earlier, at my husband's insistence, I never would have known. But there he was on my phone screen, trying door handles, peering through windows, pacing like he belonged there. I sent the footage straight to my attorney. Her response was immediate. They just helped us. That night, I watched one of the videos my husband had left. I sat alone in the living room, lights dimmed, the house quiet except for the sound of his voice filling the space again. He looked straight into the camera, calm, composed, unmistakably himself. If you're watching this, then they're probably already making things difficult. My chest tightened. I need you to hear this clearly. Everything I built with you. I did not leave room for interpretation. I did not leave gaps for manipulation. He paused, like he was choosing his words carefully. They may try to rewrite our life. Don't let them. I pressed my hand to my mouth, tears slipping down my face, not from sadness this time, but from certainty. He had anticipated every move, every accusation, every attempt to paint me as temporary. The court date was scheduled 2 weeks later. In that time, the pressure intensified. Family friends stopped calling. Whispers started circulating about greed, about betrayal, about me moving too fast. I recognized the strategy immediately. If they couldn't win legally, they'd try socially. I stopped explaining myself. Silence, I was learning, is powerful when you're standing on truth. The night before the hearing, I laid out my outfit carefully. Simple, professional, unshakable. I placed the USB drives in my bag alongside the documents my husband had signed with deliberate clarity. I stood in front of the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. She wasn't broken, she wasn't pleading, she wasn't afraid. She was ready. Because tomorrow, for the first time since my husband died, I wouldn't be defending my place in his life. I'd be proving it. And when the courtroom doors closed behind us, his siblings would finally understand something they never expected. Love, documented properly, is unerasable. And the truth they tried to bury was about to speak for itself. The courtroom smelled like old paper and quiet judgment. I arrived early, not because I was nervous, but because I needed a moment to breathe in a space where no one could interrupt me. The wooden benches were cold beneath my fingers as I sat alone, my bag resting at my feet, the weight of its contents heavier than any purse should ever be. Across the room, my husband's siblings filed in together. They didn't look at me at first. They huddled, whispering, glancing over like I was a problem they hadn't expected to linger. His sister wore black, but it wasn't mourning, it was performance. His brothers looked irritated, already tired of a fight they believed should have been over. I realized then that they'd never truly prepared for resistance. They had prepared for grief, for confusion, for compliance, not for me sitting upright, calm, with evidence in my bag and certainty in my chest. My attorney arrived and placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. "Whatever happens today," she said quietly, "remember, you're not asking for permission, you're asserting truth." That grounded me. When the judge entered, the room shifted. Formalities began. Names were called, statements were read, and then, inevitably, their attorney stood. He spoke with confidence, the kind built on assumption rather than fact. He talked about family expectations, about long-standing intentions, about how my husband's marriage should not have excluded blood relatives from legacy decisions. I felt something settle in me as he spoke. Not anger, clarity. Because every word he said was built on something fragile, opinion. When it was our turn, my attorney stood slowly. She didn't rush, she didn't dramatize, she let the silence work first. Then she said, "We'd like to submit evidence." The judge nodded. The USB drives were handed over. Letters, documents, signed records, and then something they hadn't prepared for. Video. The courtroom monitor flickered to life, and my husband appeared on screen. Alive, clear, unmistakably himself. His sister inhaled sharply. One brother shifted in his seat. The other stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. My husband's voice filled the room. "I'm making this recording to be very clear. There should be no confusion after I'm gone." He stated my name, our years together, his decisions. He spoke about intent, not vaguely, not emotionally, but precisely, about why he chose me, about how he had already provided for others during his lifetime, about how his estate was not a family committee decision, it was his. The judge leaned forward. The attorney across the room stopped taking notes. And I sat there, hands folded, heart steady, listening to the man I loved protect me one last time. When the video ended, the silence was absolute. No whispers, no murmurs, no confidence left to borrow. Their attorney cleared his throat. "We were not aware of these recordings." My attorney didn't respond. She didn't need to. The judge looked directly at my husband's siblings. "Do any of you dispute the authenticity of this evidence?" No one answered, not because they couldn't speak, but because they couldn't lie their way out anymore. The judge called for a recess. As everyone stood, my husband's sister finally looked at me, really looked. Her face had changed, not angry now, not entitled, afraid. Because for the first time since my husband passed, the story they'd been telling themselves was collapsing in public. And we weren't done yet. Not even close. Recess didn't bring relief. It brought desperation. In the hallway outside the courtroom, my husband's siblings closed ranks like a wall. His sister paced, heels clicking sharply against the tile. One brother whispered urgently into his phone. The youngest leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes never leaving me, as if staring long enough might undo what had just happened. My attorney stayed beside me, calm, unbothered. "They didn't expect proof," she said quietly, "especially not that kind." I nodded. My hands were steady now. Whatever fear I'd carried into that building had burned off the moment my husband's voice filled the room. He'd done what he always did, said exactly what needed to be said, clearly and without apology. Still, grief brushed against me unexpectedly. Hearing him speak in present tense hurt in a way I hadn't prepared for. But it also strengthened something in me, because this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about honoring his clarity, his foresight, his love. The judge called us back in sooner than expected. When proceedings resumed, the tone had changed. The questions were sharper, more direct, less patience for vague explanations and emotional appeals. My husband's sister took the stand first. She spoke about family tradition, about how she believed her brother wouldn't have wanted conflict, about how she felt the estate should be shared fairly. The judge listened carefully. Then my attorney stood. "Were you present when your brother signed any of the documents you referenced?" "No." "Did he witness him make any verbal promises contradicting the written and recorded evidence?" "Well, no, but..." "Did your brother ever tell you he intended to exclude his wife from his estate?" Her pause lasted too long. "I assumed..." "Thank you," my attorney said calmly. "No further questions." Assumptions don't hold up well under oath. Each sibling followed a similar pattern: emotional statements, no documentation, no first-hand knowledge, nothing but belief, and belief isn't evidence. Then it was my turn. I took the stand and told the truth, not dramatically, not defensively. I spoke about our marriage, about the conversations we had, about how careful my husband was, especially when it came to planning. I didn't accuse, I didn't speculate, I didn't need to, because the facts were already doing the work. At one point, the judge looked at me and asked, "Did you have any role in preparing these documents?" "No," I answered honestly. "My husband did. He wanted everything clear so I wouldn't have to fight." That landed. By the time the final arguments ended, the room felt different, lighter somehow, like a weight had shifted off my chest and onto the truth where it belonged. The judge leaned back, fingers steepled, eyes moving slowly across the courtroom. "Here," he said, "I will review the submitted evidence in full, but I want to be very clear about one thing." He paused. "Marriage is not provisional. A surviving spouse is not a placeholder, and a person's documented intent carries significant weight." My husband's sister looked down at the table. For the first time, I saw something I hadn't seen before: regret. Not because they were sorry, but because they had miscalculated. The judge set a date for the ruling. As we gathered our things, my attorney leaned toward me. "They know how this is going to go," she said. I believed her. But what surprised me most wasn't the shift in power or the collapse of their confidence. It was how calm I felt. No rush of victory, no hunger for revenge, just a deep, quiet sense of rightness. My husband had spoken, the truth had been heard, and whatever the final ruling, I knew this: they could never erase me again. Because I wasn't just defending an inheritance, I was standing inside a love that had already proven itself, legally, publicly, and unmistakably. And that kind of certainty changes everything. Waiting is its own kind of torture. Once the hearing ended, the adrenaline drained out of me all at once. I returned to the house alone, the same house they'd told me to leave just weeks earlier, and for the first time since my husband died, the silence felt different. Not empty, expectant. I walked room to room, touching things slowly: the back of the couch where he used to sit, the bookshelf he insisted on organizing by height instead of genre, the window he always opened a crack no matter how cold it was. These weren't assets. They were proof of a life shared, a life no one else had the right to audit. The calls started that night. Unknown numbers. Voicemails left without names, messages that began with, "We just want to talk." I didn't answer any of them. My attorney had been clear. "Let them sit with it," she said. "People reveal more when they think they're losing." And reveal they did. A mutual friend called me 2 days later, voice hesitant. "They're saying you manipulated him," she said softly, "that you isolated him, that the videos were coerced." I closed my eyes. There it was. The last card people play when evidence doesn't bend: character assassination. I thanked her for telling me and hung up without defending myself. I didn't need to. The court had already seen the truth, and anyone who truly knew my husband knew how absurd those claims were. Still, the grief resurfaced in waves. At night, it hit hardest. I'd wake up reaching for him, forgetting for a split second that he was gone. Then the reality would settle back in, heavy and unavoidable. On those nights, I rewatched one of the videos, not the legal ones, but the personal messages he'd recorded just for me. "You don't owe anyone explanations," he said in one, "and you don't have to stay kind to people who are cruel in the name of family." I listened to that line more than once. 3 weeks passed, then 4. No ruling yet. The siblings tried a different tactic, showing up together at the house while I was inside. I watched them through the window, their silhouettes familiar and unwelcome. His sister knocked softly at first, then harder. "We just want to resolve this," she called through the door. "This is tearing the family apart." Family. I stood on the other side of the door, heart pounding, and realized how much that word had changed for me. "I'm following the legal process," I said evenly, not opening it. "Please leave." They didn't respond right away. When they finally walked away, I felt something close to triumph, but it wasn't about winning. It was about boundaries. For the first time, I wasn't shrinking to keep the peace. I wasn't negotiating my worth. I wasn't apologizing for existing in the space my husband had chosen for me. And that terrified them. Because people who are used to taking power panic when it no longer works. That night, as I locked the doors and turned off the lights, my phone buzzed with a notification from my attorney. Subject: court update. My breath caught as I opened the message. "We've been notified," she wrote. "The judge has reached a decision. The ruling will be issued tomorrow morning." Tomorrow. I sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of everything pressing down on me at once. Love, loss, fear, certainty, hope. By this time tomorrow, everything would be official. The truth would be permanent. The erasure attempt would either collapse or completely. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the house breathe, pipes ticking, wind brushing the windows, the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Every sound felt amplified, like the world was holding its breath with me, waiting to see which version of my life would become permanent by morning. At 6:12 a.m., my phone buzzed. A message from my attorney. "Call me as soon as you're awake." My stomach tightened, but my hands were steady as I dialed. I had already lived through the worst parts of this. Whatever came next, I would survive it too. "Good morning," she said when she picked up. Her voice was calm, but there was something else there. Satisfaction, maybe, or relief. "The ruling has been entered," she continued. "I want you to hear this clearly." I held my breath. "The court affirmed your husband's estate plan in full. You are the sole beneficiary. The claims against you were dismissed." For a moment, I couldn't speak, not because I didn't understand, but because my body was catching up to my mind. The tension I'd been carrying for weeks, months, years began to loosen all at once, and my eyes filled with tears I hadn't realized I'd been holding back. "They can't appeal successfully," she added. "The evidence was overwhelming." Overwhelming. That word echoed in my chest. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed and pressed my feet into the floor, grounding myself in the reality of it. It was over, legally, officially, unchangeably. My husband's siblings had lost, but what surprised me wasn't the victory, it was the silence. No calls, no texts, no last-minute apologies or excuses, just quiet. By mid-morning, word had spread. A neighbor knocked on my door with a tentative smile. "I heard," she said gently. "I'm glad justice was done." Justice? I nodded, thanked her, closed the door, and leaned against it, exhaling deeply. Justice didn't feel loud. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt like permission to finally breathe. Later that afternoon, my husband's sister tried one last time. She called from a blocked number. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice, when I listened later, was softer than I'd ever heard it. "We didn't think it would end like this," she said. "We just wanted what we thought was fair." Fair? I deleted the message without responding, because fairness doesn't require erasing someone, and love doesn't need justification. That evening, I opened the box again, the one that started all of this. I reread my husband's letter, this time without shaking hands or blurred vision. I noticed details I hadn't before, the way he underlined certain words, the confidence in his handwriting, the certainty. He had known, not just what they might try, but what I would need to withstand it. As the sun set, I walked through the house slowly, this time not as someone defending her place, but as someone rooted in it. I stopped in the doorway of our bedroom and smiled through tears. They tried, but you made sure they couldn't. Still, even with the ruling in hand, I knew one truth remained. Legal victories don't automatically heal emotional wounds. Being right doesn't erase grief, and winning doesn't always bring closure. That part, the reckoning, the rebuilding, the life that comes after certainty, was still unfolding, because the end of the fight was only the beginning of something else, something I hadn't planned for, something that would test not my strength, but my peace. Peace is louder than I expected. Once the court ruling became official, the noise around me faded almost overnight. No more emails, no more concerned calls, no more people pretending to mediate something that was never theirs to fix. My husband's siblings disappeared the way people do when they've exhausted every angle and don't want to be seen recalculating in public. At first, the quiet felt suspicious. I kept waiting for another shoe to drop, another accusation, another demand dressed up as family obligation. That's what prolonged conflict does. It trains your nervous system to stay alert even after the threat is gone. But days passed, then weeks. Nothing. That's when the emotional weight finally caught up to me. Not relief, not celebration, grief. The kind that comes when you no longer have to fight. I woke up one morning and realized there was no next step to prepare for, no document to gather, no strategy call to schedule. The battle that had consumed every waking thought was finished, and suddenly I had to face the loss underneath it without adrenaline to carry me through. I let myself feel it. I cried in the shower, in the car, standing in the grocery store aisle when I saw his favorite cereal. I stopped apologizing to myself for those moments. Healing, I was learning, doesn't arrive tidy. It comes in waves, and you either let them pass through you or you drown trying to resist them. One afternoon, I sat down with a financial advisor for the first time, not because I had to, but because I wanted to be intentional. The numbers were clear, the assets were secure. My future, for the first time since his diagnosis, wasn't defined by uncertainty. "You're in a strong position," the advisor said. "What do you want the next chapter to look like?" The question caught me off guard. What did I want? For so long, every decision had been reactive, responding to illness, to loss, to legal threats. Now the responsibility of choice felt almost heavy. "I want peace," I said finally, "and I want to honor him without staying stuck in what they tried to do." That night, I packed away the box, not out of avoidance, but out of respect. I placed my husband's letters, the videos, the documents into a safe and locked it. They had served their purpose. They didn't need to sit in my daily line of sight anymore. What I kept out was a single photo of us on a random afternoon, no milestone, no occasion, just us laughing about something neither of us could remember now. That was the inheritance that mattered. Still, something lingered, a question I hadn't answered yet. What happens when the people who tried to erase you realize they failed and decide they want access again? Because I knew them well enough to understand this. Silence doesn't always mean acceptance. Sometimes it means regrouping. And I had a feeling the next move wouldn't come through lawyers or courtrooms. It would come through emotion. And when it did, I would have to decide whether certainty was enough or whether I was ready to protect my peace at all costs. They came back the way people always do when they realize they've lost leverage, carefully. It started with a message from a number I hadn't saved. No name, no greeting, just a sentence that tried to sound harmless. "I hope you're doing okay. We should talk sometime." I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. Weeks ago, that message would have sent my heart racing. I would have wondered what they wanted, what angle they were taking, how much of my life I needed to brace for impact. Now it landed differently. It felt late. I didn't respond. 2 days later, another message came, longer this time, softer, more emotional. "We've all been hurting. None of this was supposed to go so far. You know your husband wouldn't want us divided." There it was, my husband's name used again like a tool. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, but it didn't turn into doubt, it turned into clarity, because grief doesn't excuse manipulation, and love doesn't require access. I forwarded the message to my therapist instead of my attorney. Her reply was simple. What do you need right now to feel safe? Safe. Not understood, not reconciled, not forgiven. Safe. That question unlocked something I hadn't fully named yet. The fight had ended, but the boundary work hadn't. Winning the case didn't automatically protect my emotional space. That part was still my responsibility. That afternoon, I ran into one of my husband's cousins at the grocery store. She hugged me too tightly, the way people do when they're trying to bridge distance without addressing why it exists. "I'm glad things worked out," she said. "Maybe now everyone can heal." I smiled politely. "Healing doesn't always look like reunion," I replied. Her expression flickered, confusion, then discomfort. I realized how accustomed people were to neat endings, apologies, family dinners, a bow tied on the story. But my life wasn't a story for their comfort. That evening, I sat alone on the couch and thought about what reconciliation would actually mean, letting people back into my life who had tried to remove me from it, allowing access to those who only acknowledged my humanity once the law forced them to. The answer came quietly. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want explanations. I didn't even want apologies. I wanted distance. Distance wasn't punishment. It was protection. So I wrote one message, short, clear, final. "I'm taking time to focus on my healing. Please don't contact me again." I read it twice, then once more, and I sent it. The response came faster than I expected. Anger, disbelief, a sudden shift in tone. "So this is how you're going to be?" I turned my phone face down and didn't answer. That was the moment I understood something crucial. The inheritance they tried to erase was never just money. It was my right to choose myself without explanation. And now that I had exercised that right, I could feel another chapter pressing forward, one that had nothing to do with courtrooms or family politics. A chapter where I had to decide who I was becoming now that certainty was secured, and whether I was brave enough to build a future that didn't include people simply because they shared a last name. That decision was coming next, and it would require a different kind of strength than anything I'd used so far. Strength, I learned, changes shape. The kind that carried me through courtrooms and confrontation was sharp, focused, reactive, forged under pressure. But now that the fight was over, that kind of strength wasn't enough anymore. What I needed next was quieter, more deliberate, harder to explain to people who expected resilience to always look like resistance. I began rebuilding my days with intention. Mornings stopped starting with email scans or legal updates. I woke up slowly, made coffee the way my husband liked it, strong, no sugar, and sat by the window while the city came to life. I let myself exist without bracing for impact. It felt unfamiliar, almost indulgent, but peace requires practice. I donated clothes I'd worn only during the fight, court blouses, stiff jackets, outfits chosen to project credibility instead of comfort. I rearranged the house, too, moved furniture, changed the guest room into a study, turned shared spaces into places that reflected who I was becoming, not who I'd been defending. Some evenings, loneliness crept in quietly. Not the sharp loneliness of betrayal, but the hollow kind that follows closure, the kind that asks, "Now what?" That question followed me into therapy. "I'm afraid of getting comfortable," I admitted one afternoon. "Like, if I relax too much, something will be taken again." My therapist nodded. That's not fear, that's memory, and it doesn't get to make decisions for you. So I made new ones. I signed up for a community workshop, something completely unrelated to grief or finance or survival. I joined a walking group. I said yes to invitations that felt safe and declined ones that felt heavy without explaining myself. People noticed the change. "You seem lighter," a friend said one night over dinner. I smiled. "I am." But the real shift happened the day I realized I no longer felt the need to tell my story to justify my boundaries. When people asked why I wasn't in contact with my husband's family, I answered simply, "It's what's best for me." No details, no defense, no shame. That was freedom. Late one night, I opened one last video my husband had recorded, not because I needed reassurance, but because I wanted connection. He smiled into the camera the way he always did when he thought I was overthinking something. "If you're watching this after everything's settled, I hope you're choosing yourself without guilt." I laughed through tears. "I am," I whispered back. What they never understood, what they could never erase, was that my husband didn't just leave me assets. He left me permission. Permission to stand firm, permission to let go, permission to build a life that didn't revolve around defending my place in it. And now, standing on the other side of certainty, I could feel the final transformation taking hold. Not a woman reacting to loss, not a widow defined by what was taken, but a woman authoring what came next. And the final test of that truth was still ahead, because healing doesn't ask whether you're strong enough to survive. It asks whether you're brave enough to live fully after you do. Living fully turned out to be the hardest part. Not because I didn't want it, but because fullness requires trust, and trust had been bruised in places I didn't know how to name yet. The first time I felt it was during a quiet afternoon at home. I was folding laundry, the windows open, sunlight drifting in like an uninvited kindness. For a moment, everything felt almost normal, too normal. And then the thought hit me, what if this is temporary? I stopped folding and sat down on the bed, my breath shallow. Loss has a way of teaching your body to expect collapse. Even when the danger is gone, the memory of it lingers, whispering warnings your mind knows aren't true. That was when I understood. Certainty doesn't erase fear. It teaches you how to walk forward anyway. I began challenging myself gently, not with grand gestures, but with small acts of faith, planning trips months in advance, making long-term commitments, saying next year out loud, and believing it belonged to me. One afternoon, I met with my attorney for the last time, not for advice or defense, but to close the file. She slid the final documents across the desk and smiled. "You handled this with more composure than most people ever could." I shook my head. "I handled it because I had to." "That's not all," she said. "You handled it with integrity." Integrity. That word followed me home. It followed me into conversations with friends who asked how I was really doing. It followed me into moments of solitude when I wondered who I was becoming now that survival wasn't my primary job. I was becoming someone quieter, more selective, less reactive, and that made some people uncomfortable. A distant relative sent me a message out of the blue. "Life's too short to hold grudges," it read. I didn't reply. Because boundaries aren't grudges, and distance isn't bitterness. They're clarity. I began volunteering at a local support group for widows, not as a speaker, not as a guide, just as someone who listened. I watched women arrive angry, numb, scared, and slowly find their footing again. I saw pieces of myself in all of them. One woman took my hand after a meeting and said, "I hope I'm as calm as you someday." I smiled gently. This calm came after chaos, I told her, and it took time. That night, I dreamed of my husband, not sick, not worried, but whole. He stood across the room from me, smiling softly, like he was watching me figure something out on my own. When I woke up, I felt an unfamiliar peace settle in my chest. Not closure, not forgetting, integration. The love, the loss, the fight, the certainty, all of it now belonged to me without pulling me backward. I realized then that the inheritance they tried to erase had failed in the most important way, because what I gained couldn't be litigated, couldn't be disputed, couldn't be taken by force or manipulation. I had learned how to trust myself again. And with that trust came one final truth, quiet, steady, and undeniable. I was no longer living in reaction to what they tried to do. I was living in alignment with who I had become. And the final step of this journey wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about choosing how I would carry this story forward. That choice, gentle, powerful, and entirely mine, was already taking shape. And in the next breath, I was ready to claim it. The day I realized the story was complete didn't arrive with ceremony. It arrived quietly on an ordinary morning when I woke up and didn't immediately think about courtrooms, accusations, or defenses. I made coffee. I opened the windows. I stood in the kitchen where my husband and I had planned a future neither of us expected to end so soon. And for the first time, the memory didn't hurt. It settled. I understood then that healing hadn't erased the past, it had placed it in the right position, behind me, informing me, not driving me. I carried my husband with me differently now, not as someone whose absence defined my days, but as someone whose love had prepared me to stand alone when necessary. His final gift wasn't the estate or the documents or the evidence that silenced his siblings. It was certainty. Certainty that I was chosen. Certainty that I was protected. Certainty that I never needed to beg for space in a life I helped build. The people who tried to erase me faded into the background of a story they no longer controlled. I didn't speak badly about them. I didn't seek closure through confrontation. I let distance do the work words never could. Peace became my practice. I invested wisely. I rested intentionally. I rebuilt without urgency. And slowly, my life expanded again, not around grief, but around purpose, around meaning, around the quiet confidence that comes when you know exactly who you are and what you survived. Sometimes I still talk to him, not in desperation, not in sorrow, but in gratitude. "You knew," I tell him. "You made sure I'd be okay." And I am. The inheritance they tried to erase became the foundation they never expected. Because what endures isn't what others attempt to take, it's what love secures beyond their reach. If you learned something new from my life story, please like this video, subscribe to join our community for more stories like mine, and comment down below where you're watching this video from. I'd truly love to know.